My name's Samantha Carter, and I had just turned 23 when my birthday night ripped the blindfold off my eyes. For years, I clung to the belief that if I worked hard enough, stayed in line, and played the role my parents wanted, they'd finally acknowledge the real me. That fantasy cracked wide open when my dad stared straight at me and said, "You're nothing but a weight we've been carrying." No soft tone, no hesitation, just sharp, flat words delivered like he was reciting a figure from a ledger. If you've ever been pushed to the sidelines by the very people meant to protect you, if you've had to piece your life together from the ground up, then you know this feeling. Hit the like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who might need to hear it, because you never know who's out there waiting to feel seen. We were sitting in the living room of our spotless suburban home just outside Seattle, Washington. Everything was arranged as perfectly as always, crisp white walls, matching throw pillows, and that lingering citrus polish scent. But the quiet felt heavier that night. My mother, Charlotte, sat with her legs wound tightly together, wearing the polite, glassy smile she usually saved for neighborhood guests. My father, Richard, had a tan folder on the coffee table between us, tapping it twice like a judge signaling that the verdict was final before the trial even started. I thought maybe we were going to talk, maybe, just maybe, they'd softened. It was my birthday, after all. But there was no cake, no card, no attempt at mending weeks of icy silence. Just that folder, and a stillness that crept into my bones. "We don't have another option," Richard said, the way he might announce a client's portfolio adjustment. "Pack your bags and be out tonight." My chest tightened. "Tonight?" I asked with a shaky laugh, certain I'd misheard. He didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. Charlotte added calmly, "It's time you learned to stand on your own. We've done more than enough." No warning, no transition, just a date on the calendar that happened to be my birthday and the end of the only home I'd ever known. I rose slowly, my knees unsteady. "That's it? You're just done?" Richard glanced at his watch. "You've got 30 minutes. And with that, the girl who colored inside every line, who bent herself backward for their approval, was handed 2 suitcases and told to disappear. What they didn't realize, what they still don't, is that I'd been quietly bracing for this moment. I didn't cry right away. I think I was too stunned. My hands moved automatically, reaching for the emergency suitcase I kept tucked in the back of my closet, the kind you've mentally packed 100 times before you ever touch the zipper. In 20 minutes I stuffed it with a few outfits, my sketchbook, a flash drive holding my design portfolio, and my toothbrush. I left behind the trophies from art competitions, the framed certificates, even the camera I'd saved for during high school. None of it truly belonged to me in that house. As I hauled my bags down the slick driveway, the spring rain came fast and cold, the way it always does in the Northwest. I didn't glance back. Couldn't. The silence in my car was louder than their words. I could still hear my mother's voice, "We've done enough." Like love had an expiration date. Like choosing a major she didn't understand meant I'd forfeited my place in the family. The truth is, the signs had been there for years. Growing up in the Carter household meant 2 things: keep the image perfect and follow the script. Charlotte was the queen of appearances, professional holiday cards, curated social media, charity events where she introduced me as our creative one with that practiced smile that never touched her eyes. She didn't mind my differences as long as they looked picture perfect. Richard controlled the money with the same precision he brought to his financial planning firm, strict, conditional, and quietly cutting. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. One sentence from him could freeze my entire world. "As long as I'm paying, you follow my rules." When I asked to join the photography club, he reminded me cameras were costly. When I wanted to redecorate my room with my own art, he said, "Let's wait until you understand the value of space." Every choice was filtered through their lens of profitability, optics, and control. Even when I was accepted into the design program at Seattle School of Arts on a partial scholarship, it became their brag line at dinner parties. "Our hard work set her up for success," Richard liked to say, as if my accomplishment was a footnote to theirs. I was proud, but their pride always came wrapped in ownership. So when I say my eviction started long before my 23rd birthday, I mean it. That night was just the curtain drop. But sitting outside my best friend's apartment, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale, I knew something else. They'd taken away my safety net, but they hadn't taken my fire. Nina, my best friend, opened the door before I even knocked. Her eyes widened at the sight of me, rain-soaked, dragging 2 suitcases that felt heavier than I did. She didn't ask a single question. Just pulled me inside and hugged me in a way I hadn't been held in years, safe, unconditional, without judgment. Her roommate, Maya, peeked out from the kitchen, brows raised. "It's okay," Nina told her gently. "This is Sam. She's staying here for a bit." No hesitation, no negotiation, just a space freely offered. I wanted to cry, but all I managed was a quiet thank you. They cleared a corner of the living room for me, a futon, a thin blanket, and a single throw pillow. It wasn't much, but it felt like a palace. For the first time in years, I didn't fear someone bursting in to demand I justify my existence. Still, beneath the gratitude, a steady thrum of panic hummed under my skin. I didn't have a roadmap. No apartment lined up. No real savings, just the stash of emergency cash I'd hidden in a coffee tin under my dorm bed last semester. And the worst part? In less than 2.5 weeks, the final payment for my tuition would be due, and I had no idea where the money would come from. When my parents kicked me out, they didn't just lock the door, they cut every single line I'd been relying on, the shared bank account, the auto-pay for my car insurance, my health coverage. All of it gone overnight. It wasn't the first time they'd used money to make a point. At 21, I tried to move into an off-campus apartment with a couple of friends. I'd worked extra shifts at the student cafe for months, scraping together just enough for the deposit. But Richard must have been watching my bank account, because before I could sign anything, he called the landlord himself. He told him I wasn't financially reliable and then froze my access to my own savings. Later, in that same cool, emotionless voice, he told me, "If you want independence, you have to be able to afford it, and you can't." Those words stuck. Not you shouldn't. Not you're not ready. Just you can't. But this time wasn't like before. I wasn't just hurt, I was done. Done with obedience. Done pretending their help didn't come with invisible chains. What they didn't realize was that I'd already been building a life they couldn't fully control. I'd been tucking a portion of my cafe wages into a separate account they didn't know existed. I'd stored my own copies of design software on my personal drive. I'd carved out a quiet little pocket of freedom in secret. Now, I had to decide what to do with it. Even with my life scattered across the floor, some stubborn part of me had already started reaching for the glue. That night, I barely slept. I stared at the cracked ceiling in Nina's apartment, listening to the hiss of the old radiator. The futon groaned every time I shifted, but it wasn't the noise that kept me up, it was the sheer weight of what had just happened. My mind kept replaying the moment Richard handed me that folder, his voice saying, "You've got 30 minutes, like a judge handing down a sentence. I kept asking myself how I hadn't seen it coming. But the truth is, when you're raised to believe love is conditional, you'll spend your whole life trying to earn it, even when it's never actually coming. By morning, my throat ached from holding back tears. I didn't have the luxury to break down. I slipped out quietly, telling Nina I needed to clear my head. I wandered the city without a plan, my boots splashing through rain puddles, my thoughts as scattered as the clouds above me. Eventually, I ended up in the university library. I opened my laptop and logged into the only bank account still fully mine, the one I'd opened in secret almost a year earlier. The balance glowed back at me, $743.52. Not enough for rent. Not enough for much of anything. I sat back and let it sink in. My parents hadn't just walked away emotionally, they'd built my entire life so it would collapse without their input. Every allowance, every gift, every tuition payment had been a leash disguised as generosity. The house I grew up in had never really been home. It was a controlled system. And now that I was out of it, I was free, but utterly on my own. I knew I couldn't waste time. I flipped open my sketchbook and scribbled a list in the margins. Call financial aid. Talk to my cafe manager about extra shifts. Apply for emergency housing. Look into short-term student loans. No space to feel. No space to process. Just action. By the time I made it to my design class that afternoon, my exhaustion was written all over me. Dark circles, rumpled hoodie, smudges of paint still on my fingers from a last-minute project. Professor Camden stopped me as the class emptied. "You doing okay, Sam?" he asked gently. I opened my mouth to say I'm fine, but the words wouldn't come. My throat closed up, my lips trembled, and before I could stop myself, it all came spilling out. They kicked me out. "I don't have anywhere to go." He didn't look surprised. Maybe he'd seen the storm before I did. He just nodded and said, "You've got talent. And there are people who see you. Let us help." For the first time in days, I felt truly seen, not corrected, not managed, just seen. And even with my hand shaking, I realized something. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about taking back the pieces of myself they tried to erase. Because it wasn't just the eviction that broke me, it was the years of quiet control leading up to it, thread by thread, until one day I found myself tangled in a net I hadn't even noticed. And one of the tightest knots in that net? My major. Richard never believed in art. To him, design was a hobby, not something worthy of real investment. "Graphic design doesn't pay the bills," he'd say during our monthly budget talks, tapping the rim of his wine glass like it was keeping time for my inevitable failure. "Real jobs solve real problems." What he meant was, become someone we can brag about, or don't become anything at all. Still, I pushed on quietly. I stayed late in the studio. I took side jobs. I applied for internships without telling them. But I lived with the constant fear that the facade would crack and they'd stop pretending to tolerate it. That day came 3 months before graduation. We were sitting at the dinner table. Charlotte had made her signature lemon chicken, like it was just another Sunday. I remember the smell vividly, maybe because it was the last time I'd smell it in that house. The silverware clinked softly, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd make it through one meal without a fight. Then Richard set his fork down. "Sam," he began, "we need to have a serious talk about your direction." I froze. Charlotte reached for her glass of water without meeting my eyes. I already knew where this was headed. "You've had your fun with art," he continued, "but 4 years is long enough. If you want our support through graduation, you'll need to switch to business or economics. Something with long-term stability." "I'm 3 months away from finishing my portfolio," I said. "I've already applied for jobs. This is what I want." "This is what you want," he repeated, like I was a child asking for dessert before dinner. "But it's not what you need." Charlotte chimed in softly, "We just want you to have a life that works, sweetheart." Safe. That word again, the one they always hid behind like a shield. In their language, safe didn't mean secure. It meant status. It meant control. I set my fork down, my appetite gone. "So if I don't change my major, you're cutting me off?" Richard didn't even blink. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The walls seemed to close in, the air thinning around me. I looked between them, 2 people who claimed to love me, but only if I reflected their blueprint. "I'll figure it out," I whispered, my voice unsteady. "You'll regret this stubbornness," Charlotte said, her tone sharp, like a warning wrapped in silk. But even with my future dangling by a thread, something stirred in me, something I hadn't felt in years. Conviction. They could strip away their money, but they couldn't take away who I was becoming. The weeks after that dinner were brutal. Richard didn't just pull his financial support quietly, he made it a performance. He set up a budget review for the following Sunday, complete with color-coded spreadsheets. Every expense he circled felt like a public shaming, a $7 design plug-in frivolous. A new sketch pad, non-essential. Even a $2 cup of coffee before my cafe shift earned a raised eyebrow and the sarcastic, "Is caffeine your biggest investment now?" Charlotte's tactics were quieter, but just as sharp. She started slipping in little jabs about my appearance, my friends, my so-called attitude. "Nina's nice, but is she really the influence you need right now?" Or, "You might want to fix your hair before internship interviews. First impressions matter." Her tone stayed syrupy sweet, but each word felt like a needle sliding under my skin. I adapted by going silent. Meals were tense and clipped. I kept my head down, avoided asking for anything, and moved through the house like a guest in a place that used to be mine. Through it all, I kept creating. Late at night, when the house was finally still, I'd retreat to my room and work on my final portfolio. I poured every drop of frustration, hope, and defiance into those designs. My fingers cramped from sketching, my eyes ached from the glow of my laptop, but it was the only thing that still felt like mine. Then my 23rd birthday arrived. I hadn't made any plans. After weeks of tension, my goal was to get through the day unnoticed. But Nina insisted on taking me out for a simple dinner. Nothing extravagant, just something to mark the day. I mentioned it over breakfast. Richard barely looked up from his paper. Charlotte didn't glance away from her phone. That afternoon, a text from Nina lit up my screen. Your mom just called me. Asked if I knew your plans tonight. Sounded weird. Call me. A knot tightened in my chest. In my family, that tone always meant one thing: something was being decided without me. Still, a stubborn, naive part of me clung to hope. Maybe they were planning a surprise. Maybe, despite everything, they hadn't completely shut the door. On the way home from class, I stopped at the corner bakery and picked up a single chocolate cupcake, just in case. But when I stepped inside the house that evening, the air felt too still. The lights were low. My parents were in the living room, speaking in low voices that stopped as soon as they heard my keys. Charlotte looked up with that unreadable smile. Richard gave a slight nod. We need to talk, he said. And in that moment, I knew. Whatever I'd been holding on to, whatever tiny scrap of reconciliation I'd imagined, it wasn't coming. I stood in the doorway, the chill of early evening still clinging to my coat. Charlotte sat on the edge of the couch, posture perfect, fingers laced together like she was about to mediate a business dispute. Richard had his work laptop open, and on the coffee table lay the same tan folder from last week's budget meeting. I hadn't even removed my shoes when Richard said, "Sit down, Sam." I lowered myself into the armchair opposite them, the one reserved for guests. Such a small thing, but it hit me like a punch. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was a problem to be managed. Charlotte glanced at him, then at me. We've reviewed your financial dependency, she began, like she was reading from a quarterly earnings report, and given your continued refusal to adjust your academic path, we've decided that continuing to support your lifestyle is no longer appropriate. I blinked. My lifestyle? Richard didn't look up from his screen. Your tuition, car insurance, phone bill. We've covered them because we believed you were working toward a stable future. You've made it clear you're no longer on the path we set for you. So we're done. It wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict. My throat tightened. Are you saying you're cutting me off completely? He finally looked at me, expression carved in stone. It means you'll need to move out, tonight. I actually thought I'd misheard. Tonight? You're serious? Charlotte folded her arms. We've paid your final tuition installment. Your phone will stay on the family plan until the end of the month. After that, it's yours. Your health insurance is terminated immediately. Each word hit like a hammer. Health insurance. Phone. Housing. Gone. You can't just throw me out without warning, I said, my voice shaking. It's my birthday. She rose from the couch, heading for the kitchen. The date's irrelevant. Our decision is final. Richard didn't miss a beat. You have 30 minutes to pack your belongings. Anything left becomes household property. I stared at them, waiting for some hint of bluff, but there was none. He handed me a printed list, an exit checklist, like I was leaving a company. I didn't argue. I just climbed the stairs, my legs heavy and unsteady, each step slower than the last. When I opened my closet and began pulling clothes from hangers, my hands trembled. Only one thought repeated in my head: so this is how it ends. Upstairs, the air felt colder, emptier. My room, once the only space I'd carved out for myself in a house built on performance, now felt like a staged showroom. Sterile. Distant. Like I'd already been erased. I moved like a machine, pulling open drawers, sweeping the essentials into a small duffel and one rolling suitcase. My hands shook so badly I dropped my phone twice. I didn't even know what to take. What do you pack when you're being evicted from your own life? Clothes came first, just basics, nothing they could claim as gifts or shared household property. Then my sketchbooks, flash drives, charger, toothpaste. I paused at my camera, the one I'd saved for over 3 summers of cafe shifts in high school. Technically, Richard had called it a graduation reward. I left it sitting on my desk. I didn't want to give them another reason to accuse me of taking something that wasn't mine. The last thing I picked up was the cupcake I'd bought that afternoon. It sat untouched on my desk, the single candle still taped to the wrapper. It felt like a cruel punchline now, a quiet hope that maybe somehow, they'd remember I was more than a disappointment. I scanned the room one final time. Every framed photo from recitals, competitions, award nights still lined up perfectly on the shelves. But none of it felt like it belonged to me anymore. Richard's voice drifted up the stairs, clipped and commanding, like a boss telling a temp their shift was over. 15 minutes. I zipped my bag and forced a shallow breath past my chest. Then I grabbed my keys, my jacket, and walked downstairs carrying my life reduced to 2 bags and a backpack. They were waiting in the living room exactly as before. Charlotte didn't say a word. Richard extended his hand. House key. I unclipped it from my lanyard and dropped it into his palm without speaking. Charlotte studied me like I was a stranger passing on the street. You're being dramatic, she said as I reached for the door. We've given you everything. I turned back, my voice low but steady. You've given me conditions. And now I'm choosing something else. Stepping outside, the cold night air sliced through my clothes. Rain had started again, and in Washington, the sky never asked permission to pour. It soaked through my hoodie as I loaded my bags into the car, my hands trembling. In the driver's seat, dripping and shaking, I clenched my jaw to keep from crying. My reflection stared back at me from the rear view, hair plastered to my face, eyes swollen, lips pressed tight. Happy birthday, Sam, I whispered. Then I turned the key and drove into the dark, away from the house I once called home and toward whatever was waiting. Nina opened the door in flannel pajama pants and a blanket slung over her shoulders, worry etched deep in her face. She didn't say a word at first, just pulled me into a hug. The first touch all day that came without judgment or strings, and it nearly broke me. Maya shuffled out of their tiny bedroom, rubbing her eyes. You okay? She asked softly, her voice thick with sleep. I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't okay, but I was beyond unraveling. I was in that strange, numb mode where survival overrides everything else and tears can't reach you. They cleared a spot for me on the couch. Nina brought a towel. Maya found an extra blanket. Together, they turned a cramped corner of their apartment into something that felt safe. Not perfect, not permanent, but safe. I didn't sleep. I lay curled on the futon, staring at the cracked ceiling, my bag still zipped beside me as if I might have to run again at any moment. Around 3 a.m, I checked my secret bank account. The balance blinked back at me, $782.41. My emergency cash, the money I'd squirreled away from side gigs and cash cafe shifts, was still there, but the shared account my parents insisted I keep for convenience was gone. Access revoked. It felt intentional. Like they'd anticipated I might try to breathe without them, and decided to cut off the oxygen. I couldn't go back to sleep after that. I sat in the kitchen with a mug of hot water, no tea, just heat, while the old fridge hummed behind me and the city outside stretched into morning. By 7 a.m., I was already on campus, waiting outside the financial aid office with my student ID clutched in my hand like squeezing it hard enough might prove I belonged there. A woman named Carol let me in. She had the weary kindness of someone who'd seen too many students breaking under pressure. I need help, I said. My voice cracked. She listened, nodded, then gave me the answer I dreaded. Your FAFSA still lists your parents as financial supporters. Without documentation proving full independence or emancipation, we can't recategorize your aid. I wanted to scream, to tell her I'd been thrown out last night, that I didn't even have a bed anymore, but instead I nodded as she handed me a stack of papers, emergency loan forms, food program contacts, numbers for housing assistance. I walked out with more paper than hope. Standing on the front steps as rain started again, one truth rang louder than anything else: they hadn't just taken my home. They'd taken my safety net, my future, my breath. And I was going to have to learn to breathe on my own. The next 2 days blurred together in a haze of panic and exhaustion. I bounced between campus offices and the cafe, begging for extra hours, applying for anything that might keep me afloat: emergency housing, textbook grants, even a one-off gig designing flyers for the Student Wellness Center. Every conversation felt like pleading for the right to exist. And still, Richard's shadow lingered. My phone buzzed every few hours with messages from him, curt, almost corporate: return any family property you took, including your laptop, your suitcases, and any electronics paid for during high school. As if I'd robbed them. As if the tools I'd used to survive school and build my future were on loan. Charlotte, of course, didn't speak to me directly. Instead, she reached out to relatives with her version of the story, painting me as the rebellious daughter, disrespectful and ungrateful, while she and Richard were heartbroken. I didn't hear it from them. I found out through Nina, who'd overheard it in a group chat. Her cousin's friend went to the same church as my aunt. That's how I learned my own family was rewriting the story without me. It wasn't just rejection. It was a clean, deliberate cut. And then came the moment I almost shattered. I was finishing a double shift at the cafe, running on maybe 4 hours of sleep and a granola bar, when I checked my personal bank account, just for a sliver of reassurance. But it wasn't the number on the screen that froze me. It was the bold red banner, account frozen, under dispute. I stared, my breath catching. That account had my name alone on it. I hadn't touched $1 that wasn't mine. But somehow, Richard had convinced the bank to flag it. Maybe he claimed it was fraudulent. Maybe he pulled some financial string I didn't even know existed. All I knew was this: the last bit of independence I had was gone. That's when Miles found me. We had advanced digital design together. He was one of those quiet types who only spoke when he had something worth saying. I was in the back of the campus computer lab, eyes locked on that frozen screen, trying not to break down, when he walked by and paused. "Bank trouble?" he asked softly. I nodded. My parents froze everything. "I have nothing left." He didn't look shocked. Just pulled out the chair beside me, opened his laptop, and said, "Yeah. Mine did the same thing when I came out." I blinked. "How did you survive?" He gave a wry, tired half-smile. "Let's just say when emotional control stops working, some parents switch to financial sabotage. But there are ways to protect yourself. I learned the hard way." He leaned in. "The systems aren't as airtight as they think." And right then, for the first time in days, I felt something shift. Not rage. Not grief. Something quieter, sharper, like the flicker of a match in the dark. Possibility. Maybe I wasn't as powerless as they wanted me to believe. That night, we met at a 24-hour diner just off campus. The place smelled like burnt coffee and cracked vinyl, but it was quiet, and no one cared what two exhausted college students were whispering about over lukewarm tea and fries at midnight. He brought his laptop. I brought everything else, my shame, my anger, my grief, all zipped up in the same hoodie I'd been wearing for 3 straight days. "This isn't about stealing," he said, fingers tapping across the keyboard. "It's about using the access you already had, the same way they used it against you." I hesitated, unsure of where this was heading, but there was something grounding in his voice, clear, logical, calm. Not revenge-fueled. Just self-protective. "They ever use your name on accounts? Make you help set up their systems?" he asked. I nodded. "When I was 17. They never changed the passwords. Richard uses the same format for everything: his birth year, his firm name, and an exclamation point." Miles raised an eyebrow. "That's rookie-level predictable." He showed me how credit freezes worked, how flagging a card as potentially compromised didn't cancel it but forced verification steps. He explained how to place fraud alerts that were fully legitimate, how to add security questions using their real info but change one letter so any reset attempts failed. "These aren't hacks," he said. "They're protections. You're locking the door they left wide open." As he talked, I realized something chilling. Richard's entire image, his business, his social circle, his control, depended on uninterrupted access to money. The car, the club memberships, the investment accounts, all of it ran on a seamless credit pipeline. If that pipeline stalled, even a little, the ripples would spread everywhere. "Why are you helping me?" I finally asked. He didn't pause. "Because I wish someone had helped me. And because people who weaponize love don't deserve peace while you drown." I sat back, my mind racing. This wasn't about wrecking their lives. I didn't want to destroy them. But maybe it was okay to let them feel the weight of what they'd done, not with screaming, not with scenes, but in their own language. Control. The next night, I was alone in the far corner of the university library. Hoodie up, hands cold despite the heat. I didn't need Miles sitting next to me this time. I knew exactly what I was doing. I had Richard's login credentials, they hadn't changed, just like I guessed. His banking security questions were painfully predictable: mother's maiden name, first car, company name. Answers I'd known my entire life without thinking. Once I was in, I didn't touch a cent. I didn't move anything. Instead, I did exactly what Miles had taught me. I flagged both Richard's and Charlotte's credit cards as potentially compromised, not stolen, not hacked, just enough to trigger an automatic security freeze while the issuers investigated. I updated the recovery email to a masked account I'd created just for monitoring resets, one that would forward alerts to me but couldn't be traced back. Then I logged into their credit monitoring accounts and added fraud alerts using their actual information, but altered one character in the recovery answers, just enough to make every self-reset fail. Finally, I froze their credit with all 3 major bureaus. Completely legal. No fraud. No deception. Just the same safeguards anyone can use, only this time, I was the one using them. Because their currency wasn't love. It wasn't trust. It was access. And now, that access had friction. The beauty wasn't in taking anything away. It was in the delay. The tension. The inconvenience. I set up silent notifications through that masked email, every failed reset, every declined card, every change to their profile. I didn't plan to watch forever, just long enough to know the message had landed. When I finally closed the laptop, the hush of the library wrapped around me. But for once, it didn't feel hollow. It felt like an exhale after holding my breath for weeks. Walking back to Nina's apartment through the light Seattle drizzle, my sneakers splashing on the wet pavement, something strange pulsed under my skin. It wasn't joy. And it wasn't revenge. It was balance. For the first time in my life, the scales didn't tip entirely in their favor. I had no idea what the fallout would look like, but for once, I was okay with watching it play out. The first ripple hit the very next morning. At 7:46 a.m., the masked email account forwarded its first alert: attempted password reset, failed verification. By noon, I'd seen 3 more. By evening, there were 6. That afternoon, Nina texted me a screenshot from her cousin's group chat. Charlotte had posted in the neighborhood Facebook group, "If anyone's had strange banking issues this week, fraud alerts, locked cards, please DM me. We suspect identity theft." The irony almost made me laugh out loud. But it didn't stop there. By day 2, word trickled in through distant relatives and old neighbors. One said Charlotte's card had been declined at brunch with her garden club. Another had heard Richard asked a junior associate to cover lunch with a potential client after his corporate Amex failed. I didn't brag. I didn't gloat. I just watched. Each minor inconvenience was like a whisper, an echo of what they'd done to me. No warning. No safety net. No way to stop the freefall. Only now, they were getting a taste. Not enough to ruin them. Just enough to slow them down, chip away at that spotless illusion of control. I kept monitoring but didn't escalate. Even so, the ripple spread. Their car payment bounced. Their club dues were flagged as late. Charlotte cancelled her standing hair appointment, citing a scheduling conflict, but I knew better. Then came the group text from Stephanie, my cousin on Charlotte's side. She didn't realize I was still on the thread. Anyone else get a weird call from Aunt Charlotte? Something about being locked out of all her accounts? She sounded frantic. A pause. Honestly, she's been all over the place since Sam left. Reading that, something shifted in me. Not pride. Not victory. Something deeper, the kind of clarity that comes when you finally pull back the curtain on someone's world and see it for what it is: fragile, manufactured, cracked in places no one wants to admit. But with that clarity came a weight. At first, I told myself I was keeping tabs to make sure nothing traced back to me. But the truth? I was hooked. Each ding of an alert felt like justice. Closure. But it also felt like a chain. The more I watched them struggle, the more I realized I was still tethered to their chaos, just from a different angle. Late one night, folding laundry with Nina on the living room floor, she caught me refreshing the email for the 10th time in under an hour. "You check that thing like Richard used to check his investment reports," she said, eyeing me. Calm on the outside, but calculating everything. Her words landed hard because she was right. The quiet obsession had crept in without me noticing. Every failed login, every declined transaction gave me a flash of satisfaction, but it also dragged me back into their orbit. I stared at the laundry basket, the hum of the dryer filling the silence, and whispered, "I think I might be becoming like him." Nina's voice was gentle. "Sam, you're not your father. You were cornered, and you fought back. That's not the same." "But it doesn't make me free either," I said. "I thought getting even would help me breathe. But it's like I'm still holding my breath, just in a different room." She didn't try to solve it. She just sat beside me, cross-legged, and offered the kind of silence that doesn't ask for anything back. A few days later, I was in the design studio, bent over my senior portfolio, when Professor Camden stopped at my desk. He studied a new piece I'd finished, sharp angles, grayscale tones, a fractured skyline, and frowned. "This isn't you," he said, tapping the corner of the print. "Technically solid, but emotionally closed off. Like you're drawing walls instead of stories." I dropped my eyes. "It's been a hard month." He nodded slowly. "Then let the work carry that. Don't hide it. Art doesn't have to be pretty to be honest. But it should still be alive." That line stayed with me. Because for all the noise I was creating in their lives, I'd gone quiet in mine. My work was mechanical. My friendships stretched thin. My sleep fractured. I was surviving, but not living. That night, sitting in the kitchen with a mug of tea Nina had made, I opened the masked email again. Another alert. Another failed login. For the first time, it didn't feel satisfying. It felt exhausting. Because the more I watched them struggle, the more I saw it, I wasn't reclaiming my power. I was recycling their damage. And if I didn't step back soon, I wasn't just going to lose them, I was going to lose myself. 2 weeks after triggering the freezes, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line stopped my breath: Summer Internship Interview Invitation, Blue Ridge Design Collective. My heart jumped. This was the firm Professor Camden had pushed me toward. Real clients. Real budgets. And a mentorship program that could launch my career into places I'd only dreamed about. I should have been elated, jumping off the couch, yelling into a pillow like I used to when I got into design competitions. Instead, I just stared at the screen hollow. Not because I doubted my skills, but because my head was still stuck in that old house, still monitoring, still strategizing, still waiting for the next alert. I was trapped in the loop. That afternoon, I finally used the counseling appointment Nina had been nudging me to schedule for weeks. I sat on Dr. Eliza Monroe's couch at the university's counseling center, my eyes fixed on the untouched basket of tissues. I swore I wouldn't need them. I needed them. I told her everything: the eviction, the credit freezes, the masked email, the rush of satisfaction, and the ache of shame that always followed. When I ran out of words, she nodded slowly. "What you've experienced, Sam, is financial abuse," she said. "And your response, while not sustainable, makes sense. You were trying to take your power back in the only way you knew how." I sat with that for a moment before asking, "Then why do I feel worse now than I did when they kicked me out?" "Because revenge," she said gently, "still keeps you connected to the person who hurt you. Just in a different role. It becomes a second kind of captivity." That cracked something open in me. She was right. I hadn't meant to become like them. I'd just been desperate to feel in control. But instead of breaking free, I'd kept myself tied to their dysfunction, orbiting the same pain. Dr. Monroe handed me a journal. "You don't have to fix it all today. But maybe start writing about the life you want, not the one you're reacting to." That night, I sat by Nina's apartment window with a pen in hand and wrote a single sentence: "I want to build a life that has nothing to do with Richard and Charlotte Carter. No retaliation. No resentment. No more proving myself to people who never truly saw me." It was just one line. But it felt like the first brick in a new foundation. For the first time in weeks, I shut down the masked email, and didn't open it again. Letting go wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a speech or a scene. It was quiet, like turning off a light in a room I no longer needed to sit in. I expected the urge to claw back immediately, but it didn't. The next morning I made coffee with Nina, fed her cat while she showered, and sat on the couch going through my internship prep, really going through it, for the first time in weeks. It felt like breathing again. With my head cleared, I started organizing my final portfolio. I looked at each piece with fresh eyes: the jagged lines, the grayscale textures, the tight compositions. All that fear and anger woven into the art like electrical wiring. I didn't hate them. They were survival. They were truth. They just weren't the end of my story. So I started something new, a series of digital illustrations about freedom. Not in an abstract way, but in the small, unglamorous moments that feel like air returning to your lungs. The first showed a girl on a futon surrounded by suitcases, a plastic cupcake container beside her. The next was a pair of hands wrapped around a steaming mug while morning light cut through dusty blinds. Nothing dramatic, but honest. And for the first time in months, the work felt alive. A few days later, Professor Camden stopped me after class. "I don't know what shifted," he said, holding one of the new pieces, "but your voice is back. You're not creating to defend yourself anymore, you're creating to feel." I smiled. Not because I'd impressed him, but because I knew he was right. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was creating because I wanted to. The rest of my life slowly started finding shape. My emergency housing application was approved, and I moved into a tiny studio in graduate housing, barely 280 square feet, but mine. My name on the lease. My key in the lock. No conditions. Nina helped hang a few prints on the walls. Maya showed up with a second-hand lamp that leaned to one side and said, "Every artist needs weird lighting." We laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. Even Miles texted me one night, "Saw your portfolio update on the student board. That new piece with the window light? That's you, finally." And just like that, no big ceremony, no dramatic announcement, I was building something. Not as their daughter. Not as their burden. As me. Fully, quietly, completely. Spring crept into Seattle softly that year, light rain instead of downpours, cherry blossoms pushing through cracks in the sidewalks, the sunlight through my studio window falling in angles I'd never noticed when I was just surviving. It had been almost a month since I'd heard from Richard or Charlotte. The silence that once felt like abandonment now felt like space, room to think, room to create, room to be. The summer internship interview at Blue Ridge Design Collective went better than I could have imagined. I walked in with a hard drive full of new work, and for the first time, I didn't carry the weight of needing to prove myself to anyone. It was just me, my work, and the story I was finally ready to tell. A week later the offer came, part-time to start, with the option to move to full-time after graduation. Paid. Flexible. Best of all, the offer came with a mentor, someone who actually believed in my design voice without trying to rewrite it. I was barefoot in my little studio when the email came through, a mug of coffee in hand, sunlight stretching across the floorboards. And I cried, not from fear this time, but because I finally wasn't on the outside looking in. Life began to settle into a new rhythm. Mornings started with tea and music instead of doom scrolling. I split my time between work and classes, picked up small freelance jobs from student groups, and even started saving again, 20 here, 40 there. It wasn't much, but it was mine. One evening, I came home to find Nina waiting outside my building, holding a pizza box and wearing a grin that said she was up to something. "What's this?" I asked, unlocking the door. "We're reclaiming your birthday," she said, stepping inside behind me. "A month late, on your terms this time." Inside the box was a small chocolate cupcake, a single candle standing tall in the center. I stared at it, feeling that old ache stir, but this time, it didn't sting. I blew out the candle, not wishing for their love, but making a quiet promise to myself, "You made it without them. And you're still rising." Later that night, I opened my journal. I didn't write about them or the past. I wrote about what I wanted next, about the version of me that existed beyond their shadow. And I realized something: healing doesn't always arrive like a lightning strike. Sometimes it's a simple night, a safe roof, and a cupcake shared with someone who never asked you to shrink. Sometimes it's just breathing, and this time, I wasn't holding my breath. The next morning, I woke to sunlight creeping across my hardwood floor and the smell of leftover pizza in the air. It was an ordinary moment, but it felt like a milestone. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up tense. I didn't reach for my phone, bracing for a frozen account or another demand from Richard. My body wasn't coiled for a fight. I just existed. And in that stillness, I found clarity. I wasn't just recovering from what they'd done. I was building something entirely new. The internship at Blue Ridge was already changing how I saw myself. Each week, I worked under a senior designer who treated me like a peer, not a pity project. She gave me real feedback, asked about my vision, even had me co-present on a client pitch. I was being seen not as someone's daughter trying to prove herself, but as an artist with her own voice. And that voice was getting louder. One afternoon, Professor Camden pulled me aside after class. "There's an open slot in the end-of-year student showcase. You in?" "Yes," I said, before he could even finish. The night of the showcase, I stood in a repurposed gallery on Alberta Street, surrounded by thrifted blazers and buzzing nerves. My work hung on the far wall, 5 illustrations from my reclamation series, the pieces I'd made in the weeks after I let go of my revenge. People stopped. They looked. They asked questions. A woman in a grey coat asked if I'd sell prints. A gallery owner handed me a business card. And through it all, I kept scanning the room, half expecting to see Richard lurking in the corner, arms crossed, ready to tear it down, or Charlotte gliding past with polite indifference, speaking about someone else's daughter. They weren't there. And in that moment, I realized something. This was my first real success without them. Without their money. Without their approval. And I didn't miss them, not in that space, not in that moment. Because it was mine. After the show, Nina hugged me so tightly she nearly knocked my portfolio to the floor. I told you, she whispered. You were always this good, they just never let you see it. I smiled through tears I didn't try to hide. I wasn't hiding anymore. Not my voice. Not my story. And definitely not my worth. A few days later, the silence broke. An email from Richard landed in my inbox. Subject line in all caps, family property outstanding. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just a list of items he believed I still had. My laptop. My high school camera. Even the suitcases I'd packed when they forced me out. I stared at it for a long moment. Not angry. Just tired. There was no mention of the eviction. No apology. No recognition of what had happened. It read like I'd borrowed a few things on vacation and simply forgotten to return them. I replied with one sentence, I took only what was mine. Nothing more. No signature. No warmth. Just a boundary. 3 days later, Charlotte sent her own email, longer, carefully phrased, every word dipped in sugar. We're ready to move forward. Perhaps we can all begin again now that emotions have cooled. Family is too important to let misunderstandings linger. Misunderstanding. As if being thrown out on my birthday with 30 minutes to pack had been a minor disagreement. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded it to Dr. Monroe. She wrote back within the hour, you don't owe them reconciliation. You owe yourself peace. Respond only if you feel grounded. I didn't. And for the first time, that felt like the answer. And if I ever did respond, it would be with the truth. That night, I wrote a letter I never intended to send. I wrote about what it felt like to be discarded. How the silence cut deeper than yelling ever could. How their love always came wrapped in conditions I could never satisfy. When I finished, I folded it, slid it into my journal, and left it there, not for them but for me. Because I'd finally learned something it had taken me years to understand. Closure doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it's deciding you don't need their version of the story to keep moving forward with your own. Since then, I've kept contact minimal, short, neutral replies to logistical questions about insurance paperwork or school records. Nothing more. No holidays. No phone calls. Just distance. And in that distance, I've found space. Space to grow. To create. To trust. To build something with no trace of them in it. Their silence doesn't control me anymore. Their noise doesn't reach me. A year later, almost to the day, I was standing barefoot in the middle of my little studio. The window was cracked open just enough to let in the breeze off the water. My final design project was drying on the table. Nina was on her way over with takeout. Somewhere in the background, my own playlist hummed, not curated for anyone else, just for me. I lit a candle. Not for celebration, but for clarity. For the girl who walked into the rain with nothing but 2 bags and a broken heart. For the woman who now knew what it meant to live on her own terms. This wasn't the life I once pictured. It was the life I built, piece by piece, after everything that held me up collapsed. I used to think healing meant confrontation, that one day I'd stand in front of my parents and deliver the perfect words to make them finally see me. But here's what I've learned, some people choose not to see you. Not because you're invisible, but because acknowledging your light forces them to face their own shadows. And you can't force that kind of awakening. So you set boundaries. You protect your peace. And you keep walking. I don't regret what I did, the freezes, the silence, the distance. It wasn't petty. It was necessary. It was the only language they understood, and I spoke it just long enough to get free. But real freedom didn't come from watching them stumble. It came from no longer needing them to stumble at all. What mattered most wasn't the revenge, it was choosing to stop letting their approval, or the absence of it, define my worth. It was learning how to be proud without permission. So if you're hearing this right now, if you've been told you're too much, too emotional, too difficult, too expensive to love, hear me when I say this, you are not too much. You were just planted in the wrong soil. And it's okay to leave. It's okay to grow somewhere else. The strongest thing I ever did wasn't fighting back. It was choosing peace over proof. And now, I live in that peace every single day. If this story found you at the right time, if you recognized yourself in any part of it, like, share, or comment. You never know who else might need to be reminded that survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. Thank you for being here. And wherever you're headed next, I hope it's somewhere you can finally breathe.